The night I turned 9 years old, my stepbrother Jake whispered 4 words that would haunt me for the next 6 years. This stays between us. Hello, beautiful souls. My name is Maiden, and at 72 years old, I'm finally ready to share the darkest chapter of my childhood with you. What I'm about to tell you happened over 4 decades ago in Phoenix, Arizona, but the pain feels as fresh as yesterday's tears. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Now let me take you back to a time when the desert heat wasn't the only thing that made me want to disappear. I was born in 1952 to a young woman named Patricia, who worked double shifts at the local diner just to keep food on our table. My biological father had vanished before I could even say his name, leaving my mother to raise me alone in a cramped apartment that smelled perpetually of bacon grease and broken dreams. When I was 7, everything changed. My mother met Robert at the diner where she worked. He was a construction foreman with calloused hands and a smile that made my mother's eyes light up for the first time in years. Robert seemed like our salvation, a steady man with a steady job who promised to take care of both of us. He had a son from his previous marriage, Jake, who was 3 years older than me and lived with us every other weekend. The wedding was small, held in our tiny living room with just a few neighbors as witnesses. I remember wearing a yellow dress my mother had sewn from fabric remnants, feeling like a princess as I watched her dance with her new husband. For the first time in my young life, we felt like a real family. We moved into Robert's house in Sunnydale Heights, a modest neighborhood where children played hopscotch on sidewalks and mothers gossiped over garden fences. The house was a revelation to me. 2 bedrooms, a proper kitchen with a breakfast nook, and a backyard with an actual swing set that Robert had built himself. My new bedroom had pale pink walls and a window that faced the mountains. I had never had my own room before, and I spent hours arranging my few belongings on the wooden dresser, pretending I was decorating a palace. Jake was quiet during those first few months. He would arrive on Friday evenings with a small duffel bag, politely greet my mother and me, then disappear into his father's den to watch television or work on model airplanes. He was 12 years old, gangly and awkward, with sandy brown hair that always seemed to fall into his green eyes. I thought he was the most sophisticated person I had ever met. This older boy who knew things about the world that I could only imagine. My mother bloomed in those early days of marriage. The constant worry lines around her eyes began to fade, and she started humming while she cooked dinner. Robert was gentle with her, bringing her wildflowers from construction sites and rubbing her feet after long days at the diner. He was kind to me too, helping with homework and reading bedtime stories in a deep voice that made even the scariest fairy tales feel safe. I remember thinking we had finally found our happily ever after. How naive I was to believe that monsters only existed in storybooks. The first sign that something was wrong came on a sweltering July evening when I was 8 years old. Robert had been called away to an emergency job site, leaving my mother, Jake, and me alone for the weekend. Mom had picked up an extra shift at the diner, desperate to save money for school clothes before autumn arrived. Jake and I were left to fend for ourselves, which usually meant watching cartoons and eating cereal for dinner. That night, I was in my bedroom changing into my pajamas when Jake appeared in my doorway. I hadn't heard him approach, and his sudden presence startled me. I quickly grabbed my nightgown to cover myself, suddenly self-conscious in a way I had never been before. "You don't need to be shy around me," he said, his voice different than usual, softer, but somehow more intense. "We're family now. Family. Members shouldn't have secrets from each other." I felt heat rise in my cheeks, not understanding why his words made me uncomfortable. "I'm just changing clothes," I mumbled, wishing he would leave. Instead, he stepped into my room and closed the door behind him. "I want to tell you something important," he said, sitting on the edge of my bed. "Something that big sisters and big brothers share." I wasn't his big sister. I wanted to protest. I was younger, smaller, and definitely not someone who knew important secrets. But something in his tone made me stay quiet, made me listen. There are special ways that family members show they care about each other, he continued, patting the space next to him on the bed. Ways that parents don't understand because they forget what it's like to be young. I sat down beside him, my bare legs dangling over the edge of the mattress, trusting him because he was older, because he was family, because I had no reason yet to fear the people who were supposed to protect me. What happened next was confusing and uncomfortable, though Jake assured me it was normal, that all siblings shared these special moments. He touched me in ways that made my stomach twist with an emotion I couldn't name, all while speaking in that gentle voice about how this was our special bond, how this proved we were really and truly family now. "This is just between us," he whispered as he finally left my room that night. "Promise me you won't tell Mom or Dad. They wouldn't understand, and it might make them sad." "We don't want to make them sad, do we?" I shook my head, agreeing because I was 8 years old and didn't know any better. I fell asleep that night feeling strange and hollow, like something had been taken from me that I couldn't quite identify. The pattern began slowly. Jake's visits to my room became more frequent during his weekend stays. Always when the adults were distracted or absent, always accompanied by gentle words about family bonds and special secrets. I began to dread Friday evenings, when I would hear his footsteps on the front porch and know that another weekend of confusion and discomfort lay ahead. My mother was so happy during this time that I couldn't bear the thought of disturbing her newfound peace. She would hum while making breakfast, dance around the kitchen while cooking dinner, and curl up next to Robert on the couch in the evenings with a contentment I had never seen before. How could I be the one to shatter that happiness with complaints about something I didn't even fully understand? School became my sanctuary during the week. I threw myself into my studies with a desperation that my teacher, Mrs. Henderson, noticed, but couldn't quite interpret. I stayed after school whenever possible, volunteering to clean chalkboards and organize supplies, anything to delay going home on days when I knew Jake might be there. My grades were excellent, but my social interactions began to suffer. I pulled away from other children, feeling somehow different, marked by the secret I carried. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. During recess, while other kids played games and told jokes, I would sit alone with a book, lost in stories of brave heroines who always found their way to safety. Mrs. Henderson tried to draw me out on several occasions. "Maiden," she would say after class, "you seem sad lately. Is everything all right at home?" I would nod enthusiastically, practicing the bright smile I had perfected for such moments. "Everything's wonderful," I would say. "I just really love reading." And I did love reading, but not for the reasons she thought. Books were my escape, my refuge from a reality that was becoming increasingly difficult to navigate. As months passed, Jake's behavior escalated. What had started as inappropriate touches and uncomfortable conversations grew into something much more invasive and frightening. He began to time his visits to my room with military precision, always ensuring that adults were absent or asleep. He would bring small gifts sometimes, candy or hair ribbons, as if these tokens could somehow make his actions acceptable. "You're growing up so pretty," he would say, running his fingers through my hair in a way that made my skin crawl. "I'm the only one who really notices how special you are." The gifts made everything worse because they felt like payments, like I was being compensated for something I didn't want to give. I would hide them in the back of my closet, ashamed of their existence but afraid to throw them away in case Jake noticed their absence. Sleep became elusive. I would lie awake on Friday and Saturday nights, listening to every sound in the house, my body tense with anticipation and dread. I learned to recognize the specific creak of the floorboard outside my door, the particular way Jake turned the doorknob to minimize noise. Sometimes I would pretend to be asleep, hoping he would leave me alone, but that strategy rarely worked. "I know you're awake," he would whisper, settling beside me on the bed. "It's better when you participate anyway. It shows you care about our family." Family. The word began to taste bitter in my mouth. This wasn't what family was supposed to feel like, I was certain. But Jake was older and more experienced. Maybe this was simply something I needed to endure, until I understood it better, until I grew up enough to appreciate these demonstrations of familial affection. By the time I turned 9, the situation had become my normal, as much as I hated it. I had learned to dissociate during Jake's visits, to send my mind somewhere far away while my body remained trapped in that pink bedroom. I would imagine myself flying over the desert, soaring above the mountains, free from the weight of secrets and shame that seemed to grow heavier with each passing week. My 9th birthday party was a small affair, just family and a few neighbors. My mother had baked a chocolate cake and hung streamers in the living room. Robert gave me a bicycle, shiny and red with a bell that chimed like music. Jake gave me a new book, Anne of Green Gables, and smiled at me across the table like he was the most wonderful big brother in the world. "Make a wish, sweetheart," my mother said as I leaned over the candles. I closed my eyes and wished with all my heart that Jake would forget I existed, that he would find someone else to share his special family moments with, that I could somehow become invisible during his weekend visits. When I opened my eyes and blew out the candles, everyone cheered, but I felt no joy in their celebration. That night, after the guests had gone home and the adults had gone to bed, Jake came to my room, carrying a wrapped present. "I saved the best gift for last," he said, settling beside me with a familiarity that made my stomach turn. "But first, we need to have our special time together. It's been too long since we've really connected." What followed was the worst encounter yet, more invasive and painful than anything that had come before. When I whimpered in discomfort, Jake placed his hand over my mouth. "Shh," he whispered. "You don't want to wake Mom and Dad, do you? They might think you were having a nightmare and worry about you." Afterward, as I lay curled in a ball trying not to cry, he placed the wrapped present on my nightstand. "Happy birthday, little sister," he said, kissing my forehead in a mockery of brotherly affection. "Remember, this stays between us. Always." I never opened that present. It sat on my nightstand for weeks, a constant reminder of that horrible night, until I finally threw it away while cleaning my room. I never found out what was inside, and I never wanted to know. The abuse continued and worsened as I grew older. Jake seemed to take pleasure in my increasing distress, in the way I would flinch when he entered a room, in how I had learned to make myself small and quiet whenever he was around. He began to threaten me more explicitly, warning me about what would happen if I ever told anyone about our special relationship. "Mom and Dad would never believe you," he would say after particularly brutal encounters. "And even if they did, it would destroy our family. Dad would have to choose between his son and his new wife, and we both know who he would pick. Is that what you want? To be responsible for breaking up Mom's marriage?" The thought terrified me more than the abuse itself. My mother had been so unhappy before Robert, so tired and worn down by the struggles of single parenthood. How could I be the one to destroy the security and love she had finally found? How could I be so selfish as to put my own comfort above her happiness? So I remained silent, carrying the weight of Jake's secrets like stones in my chest. Feeling myself grow, smaller and more invisible with each passing day, I began to believe that this was simply my lot in life, that some people were meant to suffer so that others could be happy, and that my suffering was the price of my mother's joy. I had no idea that my silence was about to be shattered in the most unexpected way, or that the night of my 15th birthday would finally bring the intervention I had been too afraid to seek for myself. But that part of my story, my dear friends, is where everything begins to change. Where a frightened little girl finally finds her voice and discovers that sometimes the people who love us are stronger and braver than we ever dared to imagine. If you're still with me on this difficult journey, please take a moment to let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Your support means everything to this old grandmother, who is finally ready to share her truth with the world. As I entered my teenage years, Jake's behavior became increasingly possessive and controlling. What had started as weekend violations now extended into phone calls during the week, checking up on what I was doing, who I was talking to, and where I was going. He had somehow obtained my school schedule and would show up unexpectedly during lunch periods, claiming he was in the area visiting friends but always managing to isolate me for uncomfortable conversations. "I've been thinking about you all week," he would say, cornering me behind the gymnasium or near the library where other students rarely ventured. "I can't wait for this weekend when we can have our real time together." These encounters left me nauseated and anxious, unable to focus on my classes or connect with my peers. I began to dread the sound of the school bell, not because it meant homework or tests, but because it might mean Jake was waiting somewhere in the shadows, ready to remind me of what awaited me at home. My academic performance, which had once been my source of pride and escape, began to deteriorate. Math problems blurred together on the page as my mind wandered to strategies for avoiding Jake's attention. English essays became impossible to complete as I couldn't concentrate long enough to form coherent thoughts. My teachers noticed the change but attributed it to typical teenage struggles, or perhaps difficulties adjusting to my parents' marriage. Mrs. Henderson, who had moved up to teach 8th grade the same year I entered her class, pulled me aside after a particularly disastrous quiz performance. "Maiden, I'm concerned about you," she said, her kind eyes filled with genuine worry. "Your work used to be exceptional, and now you seem to be somewhere else entirely. Are things difficult at home with the new family arrangement?" I wanted desperately to tell her everything, to unburden myself of the crushing weight I had been carrying alone for so many years. The words formed in my throat, desperate to escape, but Jake's threats echoed louder than my desire for help. Instead, I manufactured a smile and shook my head. "Everything's fine, Mrs. Henderson. I guess I'm just tired from staying up too late reading." The lie came so easily now, polished smooth by years of practice. She didn't look convinced, but she nodded and squeezed my shoulder gently. "If you ever need someone to talk to, my door is always open. Sometimes it helps to have an adult perspective on teenage problems." If only she knew that my problems were far from typical teenage concerns. The physical abuse had escalated dramatically by the time I turned 13. Jake had grown stronger and more confident, no longer content with the fumbling explorations of his earlier visits. He had learned to time his attacks with precision, waiting until my mother was working late shifts and Robert was watching television with the volume turned up loud. He would appear in my doorway like a specter, sometimes not even bothering to speak before pushing his way into my room and locking the door behind him. "You've been avoiding me," he would say when I tried to curl away from him. "That hurts my feelings, Maiden. I thought we had something special." The word special had become poisonous to me, associated with pain and violation and the sick feeling in my stomach that never seemed to go away. I began to hate my own body for betraying me, for growing and changing in ways that seemed to increase Jake's interest rather than diminish it. Sleep became a luxury I could rarely afford. Even on weeknights when Jake wasn't staying over, I would lie awake listening to every sound in the house, my muscles tense and ready to flee at the first sign of danger. The chronic exhaustion made everything worse, clouding my judgment and making it even harder to function in school or maintain relationships with the few friends I had managed to keep. Sophie Martinez had been my closest friend since elementary school, a spirited girl with curly black hair and an infectious laugh who seemed to find joy in everything around her. She lived 3 houses down from us and had witnessed my transformation, from a bright, eager child into a withdrawn and anxious teenager. At first, she attributed the change to normal growing pains, but as months passed, her concern deepened. "You never want to do anything anymore," she complained one afternoon as we walked home from school together. "Remember when we used to have sleepovers every weekend? Now you always have some excuse why you can't come over or why I can't stay at your house." I kept my eyes focused on the sidewalk, watching my feet move automatically forward while my mind raced for an acceptable explanation. "My parents are still adjusting to being married," I said finally. "They want family time on weekends." "But we could hang out during the week," Sophie pressed. "You barely talk to anyone anymore, Maiden. It's like you're disappearing right in front of us." Her words hit closer to home than she realized. I was disappearing, piece by piece, weekend by weekend. The girl I had been before Jake's abuse felt like a stranger to me now, someone I had known long ago but could barely remember. I had learned to make myself invisible, to take up as little space as possible, to avoid drawing attention that might lead to questions I couldn't answer. The worst part was how normal everything appeared from the outside. Robert continued to be a devoted husband and stepfather, working hard to provide for our family and treating my mother with the respect and affection she deserved. He would help me with homework when I asked, attend school events when his work schedule allowed, and never showed any sign that he suspected what his son was doing to me under his own roof. My mother bloomed in her new marriage, her happiness radiating through every room of our house. She had gained weight in a healthy way, no longer the gaunt and exhausted woman who used to collapse into bed after double shifts at the diner. She laughed more often, hummed while doing housework, and spoke excitedly about plans for the future that included college funds and family vacations. Watching her joy felt like swallowing glass. Every smile she directed at Jake, every proud comment about what a good big brother he was becoming, every moment of contentment that crossed her face was a reminder of what I stood to destroy if I spoke the truth. Jake was careful to maintain his facade around the adults, helping with household chores without being asked, bringing my mother small gifts like flowers picked from neighbors' gardens, and engaging Robert in conversations about sports and school. "I'm so grateful you and Jake get along so well," my mother said to me one evening as we folded laundry together. "I was worried about blending our families, but you two seem to have developed such a close relationship. He really looks out for you." I nodded and made appropriate sounds of agreement while my hands trembled as I folded towels. If she only knew how closely Jake looked out for me, how his attention followed my every movement, how his protection felt more like a cage closing around me with each passing day. The manipulation had become more sophisticated as Jake grew older and more confident in his power over me. He no longer relied solely on threats about destroying our family's happiness. Now he employed a more insidious form of psychological control, convincing me that I was somehow complicit in what was happening, that my failure to resist more forcefully meant I wanted his attention. "You never try to stop me anymore," he would whisper during his nighttime visits. "I think you're starting to like our special time together. That's okay, Maiden. It's natural for you to have these feelings." The suggestion that I might be enjoying my own abuse was perhaps the cruelest manipulation of all. It planted seeds of doubt and self-loathing that grew like weeds in my mind, convincing me that I was somehow dirty or broken, different from other girls in ways that made me deserving of this treatment. I began to police my own reactions obsessively, analyzing every involuntary response my body might have during Jake's assaults and interpreting any biological reaction as evidence of my own guilt. The normal physiological responses that any body might have to stimulation became, in my confused adolescent mind, proof that I was a willing participant in my own violation. This psychological warfare was perhaps more damaging than the physical abuse itself. While bruises and pain would heal, the corrosive self-doubt that Jake had planted in my mind seemed to grow stronger with time, poisoning my self-perception and my ability to trust my own feelings and instincts. By the time I turned 14, I had developed a complex system of avoidance strategies that governed every aspect of my life. I memorized Robert's work schedule and planned my activities around times when he would be home. I volunteered for every possible after-school activity, from tutoring younger students to helping in the library, anything that would keep me away from the house during Jake's visits. When avoidance wasn't possible, I learned to make myself as unappealing as possible. I stopped washing my hair regularly, wore the same clothes multiple days in a row, and adopted a hunched posture that made me look smaller and less noticeable. I hoped that if I could make myself sufficiently unattractive, Jake might lose interest and find someone else to target. The strategy backfired spectacularly. Jake seemed to interpret my deteriorating appearance as a sign of his increasing control over me, and rather than being deterred, he appeared to take pleasure in my obvious distress. "Look what you've done to yourself," he would say, examining my unwashed hair and rumpled clothes with disgust. "You're lucky I still care about you enough to spend time with you when you look like this." Even my attempts at self-protection became twisted into evidence of my unworthiness, another way for Jake to assert his dominance and reinforce my dependence on his twisted version of affection. The isolation was perhaps the most devastating aspect of my situation. I had effectively cut myself off from every potential source of support, too ashamed to confide in Sophie, too terrified to approach Mrs. Henderson, too committed to protecting my mother's happiness to risk destroying her marriage. I existed in a bubble of silence and secrecy that grew smaller and more suffocating with each passing day. Church had once been a refuge for our family, a place where we gathered every Sunday, morning dressed in our best clothes, sitting together in the third pew from the front like the picture-perfect family we appeared to be. I used to find comfort in the hymns and the gentle voice of Pastor Williams as he spoke about forgiveness and redemption and the power of faith to overcome any obstacle. But as Jake's abuse continued and intensified, church became another source of torment. The sermons about honoring thy father and mother, about the sanctity of family, about bearing burdens with grace and patience, all seemed to reinforce my obligation to remain silent. When Pastor Williams spoke about the importance of protecting family unity and working through problems with prayer and patience rather than outside interference, I heard confirmation that speaking out would be a betrayal of everything our faith stood for. Jake seemed to understand this dynamic and used it to his advantage. "God wants families to stay together," he would remind me after particularly brutal encounters. "He wants us to work through our problems ourselves, not bring shame on our family by involving strangers." The twisted theology that Jake fed me became another chain in the prison he had constructed around me, another reason to doubt my own instincts and submit to his increasingly violent demands. The physical violence had begun gradually, almost imperceptibly. A hand that gripped too tightly, a push that was slightly too forceful, restraints that left marks I had to carefully hide. But by my 14th birthday, the violence had become more explicit and more frightening. "You're getting too old to act like a baby about this," Jake would snarl when I tried to resist his advances. "Stop being so dramatic and just cooperate. It'll be over faster if you don't fight me." The pain became a constant companion, not just during the actual abuse, but in the days that followed as my body healed from injuries I couldn't explain to anyone. I learned to move carefully, to sit and stand in ways that wouldn't reveal the bruises hidden beneath my clothes, to smile and act normal even when every movement sent sharp reminders of what I had endured. School nurses became figures to be avoided at all costs. When I was required to change clothes for physical education, I developed elaborate strategies for hiding the evidence of Jake's violence. I would arrive early to claim a corner spot in the locker room, change quickly with my back to the wall, and always volunteer to help put away equipment so I could change back into my regular clothes while other students were distracted. The constant vigilance was exhausting, but it became second nature, as automatic as breathing. Every moment of every day was filtered through the lens of concealment. Every interaction carefully calculated to maintain the facade of normalcy that protected my family's happiness and my own survival. As my 15th birthday approached, I began to sense a change in Jake's behavior that filled me with new dread. He had grown increasingly confident and possessive, talking about our relationship as if it were a normal romantic partnership rather than the systematic abuse it actually was. "I've been thinking about our future," he said during one of his nighttime visits, his hands tracing patterns on my skin that made me want to crawl out of my own body. "When you graduate from high school, we could get our own place together. Nobody would have to know we're related. We could be a real couple." The suggestion was so horrifying, so completely divorced from any reality I could imagine, that I couldn't even formulate a response. The idea that Jake saw our abuse as some kind of romantic courtship, that he envisioned a future where his violence would continue indefinitely, opened up new depths of terror I hadn't known existed. "You'd like that, wouldn't you?" he pressed, when I remained silent. Just the two of us, without having to sneak around or worry about other people interfering. I managed to nod, knowing that any other response would result in immediate punishment, but inside, I was screaming. The future Jake described wasn't a life at all, but a continuation of the prison I already inhabited, extended indefinitely with no hope of escape or rescue. That night, after Jake finally left my room, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling and trying to imagine any scenario in which I could survive until graduation, let alone beyond it. For the first time, I began to seriously consider options I had never allowed myself to think about before. Running away seemed impossible with no money and nowhere to go. But there were other ways to escape, permanent ways that would end my suffering once and for all. The thought should have terrified me, but instead it brought a strange sense of peace. If I couldn't save myself, if I couldn't find the courage to destroy my family's happiness by telling the truth, then perhaps the kindest thing I could do for everyone involved was simply to disappear. I began to research methods quietly, using the school library computers during lunch periods to learn about pills and poisons and other ways to slip away quietly without causing too much trouble for the people I left behind. I wrote letters in my mind to my mother and Robert, explaining that my death had nothing to do with them, that they had been wonderful parents, and that my decision was about problems they couldn't have known about or prevented. But even as I planned my escape from life, a small part of me continued to hope that something would change, that somehow the situation would resolve itself without requiring me to take such drastic action. I clung to fantasies of Jake losing interest in me, of my family moving away, of some external force intervening to save me from having to save myself. I had no way of knowing that my 15th birthday would bring exactly the kind of intervention I had been too afraid to seek, or that the night I had dreaded for months would finally force the truth into the light in ways I could never have anticipated. The pieces were already in motion, though I couldn't see them yet. Sophie's growing concern about my behavior, Mrs. Henderson's careful observations of my declining performance, and most importantly, my mother's increasing awareness that something was terribly wrong with her daughter, even if she couldn't quite identify what it was. The silence that had protected Jake for so many years was finally beginning to crack, and soon it would shatter completely, changing everything forever. The night of my 15th birthday arrived with the oppressive heat that only Phoenix in August could deliver. The temperature hadn't dropped below 90 degrees even after sunset, and our small house felt like an oven despite the window air conditioning units running constantly. My mother had planned a small celebration, just our family and Sophie, with a homemade strawberry cake and a few modest gifts wrapped in tissue paper she had saved from Christmas. Robert had given me a beautiful silver locket with a tiny photograph of my mother and me inside, taken during happier times when her smile reached all the way to her eyes. My mother's gift was a journal bound in soft blue leather, inscribed with the words, "For all your dreams and thoughts, with love from Mom." She had no idea how desperately I needed a safe place to record the nightmares that had replaced my dreams. Jake's gift was presented last, after Sophie had gone home and my parents had retreated to the living room to watch the evening news. He knocked on my bedroom door with unusual formality, holding a wrapped package that looked expensive compared to the simple gifts I had received earlier. "Happy birthday, little sister," he said, his voice carrying an undertone that made my skin crawl. I saved the best for last. Inside the elaborate wrapping was a delicate gold bracelet with my name engraved in cursive script. It was beautiful and expensive, far beyond what a teenage boy should have been able to afford on his part-time job at the local auto parts store. The sight of my own name etched in gold felt like a brand, marking me as his property in a way that made my stomach lurch. "Do you like it?" he asked, moving closer to fasten the bracelet around my wrist. His fingers lingered on my skin longer than necessary, and I could smell the cologne he had started wearing lately. A heavy scent that would forever after make me feel nauseous. "It's very nice," I managed to say, though the weight of the gold felt like a shackle. "Thank you." "There's more," he said, his green eyes gleaming with an intensity that frightened me. "But that part comes later, after everyone's asleep. I have something very special planned for your birthday." The threat was clear, though delivered with the same gentle tone he always used when discussing our special time together. I nodded, because I had learned that resistance only made things worse, but inside I was screaming. I had hoped that maybe, just maybe, he would let my birthday pass without incident. The naivety of that hope now seemed almost comical. My parents went to bed earlier than usual, exhausted by the heat and my mother's double shift the previous day to afford my birthday gifts. I lay in my room with the door locked, though I knew the flimsy mechanism wouldn't keep Jake out if he really wanted to enter. I had changed into my heaviest pajamas despite the stifling heat, as if the extra fabric could somehow protect me from what was coming. The house settled into its nighttime quiet, punctuated only by the hum of air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic on the main road. I tried to read one of my birthday books, but the words swam together on the page as my anxiety mounted. Every small sound made me jump, convinced that Jake was approaching my room for his promised special celebration. When he finally came, it was nearly midnight. I heard his footsteps in the hallway, deliberately slow and measured, as if he was savoring my anticipation. The doorknob turned slowly, and he slipped inside without bothering to knock. In the dim light from my bedside lamp, I could see that he was carrying something in his hand, though I couldn't make out what it was. "Happy birthday, beautiful," he whispered, approaching my bed with predatory confidence. "I hope you're ready for your real present." What he produced from behind his back made my blood freeze. It was a small bottle of pills, the kind I had seen in my mother's medicine cabinet when she had trouble sleeping after particularly stressful days at work. In his other hand was a glass of water, condensation already forming on the outside in the humid air. "I thought we could try something different tonight," he said, settling on the edge of my bed with casual familiarity. "Something that will help you relax and enjoy yourself more. You always seem so tense during our special time." I stared at the pills in horror, understanding immediately what he intended. This wasn't just another assault. This was a complete stripping away of whatever small amount of control I had managed to maintain during his previous attacks. He wanted me completely helpless, unable to resist or even fully comprehend what was happening to me. "I don't want to take those," I said, my voice barely above a whisper but carrying more defiance than I had shown in years. Jake's expression hardened, and for the first time I saw genuine anger flicker across his features. "That wasn't a request, Maiden. You're going to take these pills, and you're going to do it willingly, or I'm going to make tonight very unpleasant for both of us." "No." The word came out stronger than I had intended, surprising both of us. "I'm not taking anything. I'm tired of pretending this is normal. I'm tired of keeping your sick secrets." The slap came so quickly I didn't see it coming. My head snapped to the side and I tasted blood where my teeth cut into my cheek. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the quiet house, and we both froze, listening for any indication that my parents had heard. "Now look what you made me do," Jake hissed, his voice low and dangerous. "If you wake them up, I'll tell them I caught you trying to steal Mom's sleeping pills. Who do you think they'll believe? Their troubled daughter who's been acting strange for months, or their responsible son who was just trying to help?" The threat was credible, and we both knew it. My behavior had been erratic enough lately that my parents were already concerned about my mental state. The story would be easy to believe, especially coming from Jake, who had spent years cultivating his image as the perfect stepson. "Please," I whispered, touching my stinging cheek. "Please just leave me alone. I won't tell anyone about anything, I promise. Just stop doing this to me." "It's too late for that," Jake said, grabbing my chin and forcing me to look at him. "You're mine, Maiden. You've been mine since you were 9 years old, and nothing is going to change that. Now take these pills, or I'll force them down your throat." I looked at the bottle in his hand and made a decision that surprised even me. Instead of submitting, as I had countless times before, I grabbed the bottle and threw it as hard as I could across the room. The pills scattered across the floor with tiny clicking sounds, and the empty bottle hit the wall with a small thud. Jake's face contorted with rage, and before I could react, his hands were around my throat, not squeezing hard enough to really hurt me, but tight enough to make his point clear. "You stupid little bitch," he snarled. "You're going to pick up every single one of those pills, and then you're going to swallow them while I watch. Get away from me," I said, loudly enough that I immediately regretted it. But something had broken inside me, some dam that had been holding back years of accumulated rage and desperation. "Get your hands off me right now." "Shut up," Jake snapped, but I could see uncertainty creeping into his eyes. This wasn't following his usual script, and he wasn't sure how to regain control of the situation. I said, "Get away from me," I repeated, even louder this time. "Stop touching me. Leave me alone." My voice was rising toward a scream, and Jake released my throat in alarm. We both heard it at the same time. Footsteps in the hallway, moving quickly toward my room. My mother's voice, thick with sleep but sharp with concern. "Maiden, what's wrong, honey? Are you having a nightmare?" Jake's eyes went wide with panic. In all the years he had been abusing me, he had never been caught in my room, never had to explain his presence during one of his late-night visits. He looked around frantically, as if searching for a place to hide, but there was nowhere to go. The doorknob turned, and my mother stepped into the room wearing her pink bathrobe and a concerned frown. Her eyes immediately went to Jake, sitting on my bed at midnight with his hand still reaching toward me, and then to my face, which I knew must show the mark of his slap. "What's going on here?" she asked, her voice suddenly very awake and very alert. "Jake, what are you doing in Maiden's room?" I watched Jake's mind work furiously, searching for an explanation that would make sense of the scene before my mother's eyes. "She was having a bad dream," he said finally, his voice carefully modulated to sound concerned and innocent. "I heard her crying out and came to check on her. She seemed really upset." My mother looked at me, taking in my disheveled appearance and the red mark on my cheek that was already beginning to swell. "Is that true, sweetheart? Were you having a nightmare?" This was my moment. After years of silence, after countless opportunities I had let slip away, I finally had the chance to tell someone what had been happening to me. My mother was standing right there, looking at me with love and concern, ready to believe whatever I told her. But Jake was looking at me too, his eyes promising terrible consequences if I said the wrong thing. All his threats about destroying our family, about the choice my mother would be forced to make between her daughter and her marriage, about the shame and scandal that would tear our lives apart, all of it rushed back at once. Maiden? My mother prompted gently. What happened to your face, honey? I opened my mouth, and for a moment no sound came out. Then, in a voice that seemed to come from somewhere far away, I heard myself say, I was having a nightmare. About falling. I think I hit my face on the headboard when I woke up. My mother frowned, clearly not entirely convinced by this explanation, but Jake visibly relaxed beside me. She was really thrashing around, he added helpfully. I was just trying to calm her down when you came in. That must have been some nightmare, my mother said, approaching the bed to get a closer look at my face. This looks like it's going to bruise. We should put some ice on it. As she leaned over me, I caught a glimpse of something that made my heart stop. Scattered across the floor near the far wall were the sleeping pills I had thrown, clearly visible in the lamplight. If my mother took even one more step into the room, she would see them and demand an explanation that neither Jake nor I could provide. I'm okay, Mom, I said quickly, scooting toward the edge of the bed to block her view of the floor. Really? It doesn't hurt that much. I just want to go back to sleep. Are you sure? She asked, still looking troubled. Maybe we should have your father take a look. He's dealt with enough workplace injuries to know when something needs medical attention. No, I said, probably too quickly. Please. I just want to forget about it. It was just a bad dream. My mother hesitated for another moment, her maternal instincts clearly telling her that something wasn't right about the whole situation. But Jake stood up from my bed with a theatrical yawn, playing his role perfectly. I should probably get back to my room, he said. Early shift at the store tomorrow. Sorry for the disturbance, Patricia. I just wanted to make sure Maiden was okay. That was very thoughtful of you, my mother said, though her tone suggested she was still processing what she had witnessed. Thank you for looking out for your sister. The word sister made me flinch, but neither of them seemed to notice. Jake headed toward the door, pausing only to look back at me with an expression that anyone else would have interpreted as brotherly concern, but that I recognized as a warning. Sweet dreams, Maiden, he said softly. I hope you don't have any more nightmares tonight. After he left, my mother lingered for a few more minutes, fussing over my supposedly injured face and asking if I needed anything for the pain. I assured her repeatedly that I was fine, that I just wanted to sleep, until she finally kissed my forehead and headed back to her own room. Call me if you need anything, she said from the doorway. Anything at all. When I was finally alone, I slumped back against my pillows and tried to process what had just happened. I had come closer than ever before to telling the truth, but in the end, fear had won again. The pills scattered across my floor were evidence of Jake's intentions that I couldn't leave for my mother to discover in the morning. I spent the next hour crawling around on my hands and knees, collecting every last tablet and flushing them down the toilet. As I finally settled back into bed as dawn was beginning to lighten the sky, I realized that something fundamental had changed. Jake had been caught off guard, forced to improvise, and for the first time in years, I had seen him genuinely frightened. The careful control he had maintained over our situation had cracked, and both of us knew it. The next morning brought an atmosphere of tension that seemed to permeate every corner of our house. My mother kept looking at me with worried eyes, asking repeatedly if I was feeling all right, and suggesting we make a doctor's appointment to check for a concussion. Robert examined the bruise on my face with the experienced eye of someone who had seen plenty of workplace injuries and pronounced it consistent with hitting something hard, though he seemed puzzled by the pattern. That's an odd shape for hitting a headboard, he commented over breakfast. Almost looks like you got smacked. With something? You sure you don't remember exactly what happened? I forced myself to meet his eyes and lie directly to his face. I was mostly asleep when it happened. Everything's kind of fuzzy. Jake was unusually quiet during breakfast, responding to direct questions but volunteering nothing. I caught him, watching me several times with an expression I couldn't quite read. something between anger and calculation that made my already nervous stomach churn even more. When it came time for him to return to his mother's house for the week, the goodbye felt different than usual. Instead of the casual wave or brief hug he typically gave me, Jake pulled me aside while our parents were loading his bag into Robert's truck. "We need to talk about last night," he said quietly, his hand gripping my arm just tightly enough to leave marks. "About how you acted and what almost happened. That can never happen again, Maiden. Do you understand me?" I nodded, not trusting my voice to remain steady if I tried to speak. "Good," he said, releasing my arm. "Because next time, I won't be so understanding about your little tantrum. Next time, there won't be any interruptions, and you'll take whatever I give you without making a sound. Are we clear?" "Yes," I whispered, hating myself for the submission in my voice. "I'll see you next weekend," Jake said, loud enough for our parents to hear. Then, quieter, just for me. "And we'll finish what we started." As Robert's truck pulled out of the driveway, I felt a mixture of relief and dread that had become familiar over the years. Relief that I had 5 days of relative safety, and dread because I knew that when Jake returned, his anger over my defiance would make whatever he had planned infinitely worse. But something had shifted inside me during that confrontation. For the first time in my life, I had fought back, had refused to comply with his demands, had raised my voice and drawn attention to his presence in my room. It hadn't saved me, and it had probably made my situation more dangerous, but it had proven to myself that I wasn't completely powerless. The bruise on my face served as a daily reminder of that moment of resistance, and every time I looked in the mirror, I saw evidence that I was capable of saying no, even when the consequences were terrible. It was a small spark of defiance, but it was mine, and Jake couldn't take it away from me no matter what he did. I had no way of knowing that my moment of rebellion had planted seeds of suspicion in my mother's mind that would continue to grow throughout the week. That she had noticed things about Jake's behavior and my reaction to him that didn't quite add up. That the careful facade he had maintained for so many years was finally beginning to crumble under the weight of his own escalating violence and my increasing inability to hide the damage he was causing. The crisis that would change everything was still coming, but now it felt inevitable rather than impossible. The silence that had protected Jake for so long was developing cracks, and soon those cracks would become fissures that no amount of manipulation or intimidation could repair. My 15th birthday had not brought the gift Jake had intended to give me, but it had given me something far more valuable: the knowledge that I could resist, that I could fight back, and that someday, somehow, I might find the courage to break, free from the prison he had built around me. The countdown to my liberation had begun, though I didn't know it yet. All I knew was that for the first time in years, I felt a tiny spark of hope flickering in the darkness that had consumed my life for so long. The week following my birthday incident stretched endlessly, each day bringing new anxieties and unexpected developments. My mother's behavior had shifted in subtle ways that both comforted and terrified me. She watched me more carefully now, asking gentle questions about school, my friends, and how I was feeling that seemed to probe deeper than casual maternal concern. On Wednesday afternoon, she surprised me by picking me up from school instead of letting me take the bus home as usual. As we drove through the familiar streets of our neighborhood, she seemed unusually quiet, her hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. "Maiden," she said finally, her voice carefully casual, "I've been thinking about what happened the other night, about your nightmare and the way you hurt yourself." My stomach clenched with familiar fear. "What about it?" "Well, it's just that you've been having trouble sleeping for a while now. I hear you moving around at night, and you look tired all the time. Maybe we should talk to someone about it. There are doctors who specialize in sleep problems and anxiety." The suggestion of involving a doctor sent panic shooting through my chest. "I'm fine, Mom. Really. It was just one bad dream." She glanced at me sideways, her expression thoughtful. Honey, I know you think you're protecting me from something, but if there's anything bothering you, anything at all, you can tell me. You know that, right? The words hung in the air between us, heavy, with unspoken possibility. For a moment, I imagined what it would be like to simply tell her everything, to let the whole horrible truth spill out in the safety of our car. But the familiar fear rose up to choke off any words before they could form. There's nothing to tell, I said, staring out the passenger window at the desert landscape rushing past. My mother sighed softly, and I could feel her disappointment like a physical weight. Okay, sweetheart, but my offer stands. If you ever need to talk about anything, I'm here. That evening, I overheard my parents talking in their bedroom. Their voices were low, but the walls of our house were thin, and I had learned over the years to listen carefully for conversations that might affect me. There's something wrong with Maiden, my mother was saying. I can feel it in my bones. Robert, a mother knows when her child is suffering. She's 15, Patricia, Robert replied gently. Teenagers go through rough patches. Remember how moody Jake was at that age? This is different, my mother insisted. This isn't normal teenage behavior. She's withdrawn, she's lost weight, and now she's having violent nightmares that leave bruises on her face. Something is very wrong. What are you suggesting we do? Force her to talk? That'll just push her further away. I don't know, my mother admitted, her voice breaking slightly. I just feel like I'm failing her somehow. Like there's something obvious I'm missing, something right in front of my face that I should be seeing. The pain in her voice made my chest ache with guilt. She was blaming herself for not knowing what was wrong, and I was the only one who could ease her suffering by telling her the truth. But even as I listened to her worry about me, I couldn't bring myself to walk down the hall and knock on their door. Thursday brought an unexpected visitor that changed everything. I was doing homework at the kitchen table when the doorbell rang, and my mother answered it to find Mrs. Henderson standing on our front porch with a concerned expression. Mrs. Patterson, my teacher said formally, I hope you don't mind me stopping by unannounced, but I wanted to discuss some concerns I have about Maiden. My heart nearly stopped beating. Mrs. Henderson had never come to our house before, and her presence could only mean that my carefully constructed facade was failing more badly than I had realized. Of course, my mother said, stepping aside, to let her in. Please, come in. Can I get you some iced tea? It's so hot today. They settled in the living room while I pretended to focus on my algebra homework, straining to hear every word of their conversation. Maiden has always been one of my most dedicated students, Mrs. Henderson began. But this year I've noticed some troubling changes in her behavior and academic performance. What kind of changes? My mother asked, her voice tight with worry. Her grades have dropped significantly for one thing. But more concerning are the behavioral changes. She seems constantly distracted, almost fearful. She flinches when anyone approaches her unexpectedly, and she's become increasingly isolated from her peers. I heard my mother's sharp intake of breath. I've noticed some of those things at home too. She seems so sad all the time, but whenever I try to talk to her about it, she insists everything is fine. In my experience, Mrs. Henderson said carefully, when a bright, well-adjusted child suddenly exhibits this cluster of symptoms, it often indicates trauma of some kind. Have there been any significant changes or stressful events in your family recently? Well, Robert and I got married 2 years ago, my mother said slowly, and his son Jake stays with us on weekends. But the adjustment seemed to go smoothly. Maiden and Jake get along well together. There was a pause, during which I could imagine Mrs. Henderson processing this information with her trained educator's instincts. How old is Jake? She asked. 18 now. He's been wonderful with Maiden, very protective of her. Sometimes I think he looks out for her more than necessary, but I assumed that was just him being a good big brother. Another pause, longer this time. When Mrs. Henderson spoke again, her voice carried a weight that made my blood run cold. Mrs. Patterson, I want to ask you something, and I need you to think very carefully about your answer. Has Maiden ever shown any reluctance to be alone with Jake? Any changes in behavior specifically related to the weekends when he's staying with you? The question hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. I could practically hear my mother's mind working, connecting dots she had never allowed herself to see before. "Oh my God," she whispered, so quietly I almost didn't hear her. "Oh my God, how could I have been so blind?" "I could be wrong," Mrs. Henderson said quickly. "I hope I'm wrong. But the pattern of behavior, the timing, the fact that she seems most distressed on Mondays when she comes back to school after weekends." "I need to talk to her," my mother said, her voice stronger now, filled with the determination I hadn't heard before. "I need to ask her directly." "Be gentle," Mrs. Henderson advised. "If something has been happening, she's probably been carrying this burden alone for a long time. She may be afraid to tell you for fear of not being believed or of causing problems in your marriage." After Mrs. Henderson left, the house fell into an eerie quiet. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at my homework without seeing it, knowing that everything was about to change, but not knowing whether that change would save me or destroy me. When my mother finally approached me, her face was pale but resolute. She sat down across from me at the table and reached over to close my textbook. "Maiden," she said, her voice gentler than I had heard it in years, "I need to ask you something very important, and I need you to tell me the truth." I looked into her eyes and saw something I hadn't seen before, not just love and concern, but a fierce protectiveness that reminded me of a lioness guarding her cub. "Has Jake ever hurt you?" she asked directly. "Has he ever touched you in ways that made you uncomfortable or asked you to keep secrets?" The question I had been dreading for years was finally hanging in the air between us. All my practiced denials and carefully rehearsed lies seemed to evaporate in the face of my mother's direct gaze. I started, then stopped. My throat closing around the words I had kept buried for so long. "It's okay," my mother said, reaching across the table to take my hands in hers. "Whatever it is, whatever has happened, it's not your fault. I promise you, it's not your fault." Those words, the ones I had never dared to hope I would hear, broke something open inside me. Years of accumulated pain and fear came pouring out in great, heaving sobs that seemed to come from the very depths of my soul. "He said you wouldn't believe me," I managed to choke out between tears. "He said it would destroy our family if I told." My mother's face went white, but her hands tightened around mine, anchoring me as I finally began to speak the truth I had carried alone for so long. "Tell me everything," she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. "Start from the beginning, and don't leave anything out." And so I did. For the first time in 6 years, I opened my mouth and let the truth pour out. I told her about the first inappropriate touches when I was 9, about the gradual escalation, about the threats and manipulation and the way Jake had convinced me that keeping his secrets was the price of our family's happiness. I told her about the birthday incident, about the pills and the violence and my desperate attempt to resist. I showed her the fading bruise on my face and explained how it had really happened. I told her about the years of sleepless nights and constant fear, about the way I had learned to make myself invisible and small to avoid drawing Jake's attention. My mother listened to every word without interrupting, her face cycling through expressions of horror, rage, and devastating guilt. When I finally finished, we sat in silence for a long moment, both of us crying and holding onto each other's hands like lifelines. "I'm so sorry," she whispered finally. "I'm so sorry I didn't see it. I didn't protect you. You should never have had to carry this alone." "I was scared," I admitted. "I was scared of what would happen if I told, scared of losing you and Robert. scared that maybe it was somehow my fault. "It was never your fault," my mother said fiercely. "Never. You were a child, and he was supposed to protect you, not hurt you." She stood up then, her movements sharp with purpose. "I need to call Robert. He needs to know what his son has been doing." The next few hours passed in a blur of difficult conversations and painful revelations. Robert's reaction when he arrived home was everything I could have hoped for and more. The color drained from his face as my mother explained what I had told her, and when she finished, he looked at me with tears in his eyes. "Maiden," he said, his voice breaking, "I am so deeply sorry. I brought that monster into your home, into your life. I failed to protect you from my own son." "You didn't know," I said, surprised by my own urge to comfort him. "I should have known," he replied. "There were signs, things I should have noticed. The way he looked at you sometimes, the way you seemed uncomfortable around him. I didn't want to see it." The police were called that evening. Robert made the call himself, his voice steady as he reported what had happened and requested that officers come to take my statement. When they arrived, I had to tell my story again, this time to strangers who wrote down every detail and asked questions that made me relive the worst moments of my childhood. But this time, I wasn't alone. My mother sat beside me throughout the entire interview, holding my hand and offering quiet words of encouragement. Robert paced the living room like a caged animal, his face dark with rage at his son's actions. The officers explained that Jake would be arrested when he returned for his weekend visit, that there would likely be a trial, and that the process would be long and difficult. But they also assured me that I had done the right thing by speaking up, that I was brave for telling the truth, and that they would do everything in their power to make sure Jake could never hurt me again. When the police finally left, my parents sat down with me in the living room for another difficult conversation. My mother explained that they had already decided to change the locks on the house, that Jake would never be allowed back, and that they were looking into getting a restraining order to keep him away from me permanently. "What about your relationship? With him?" I asked Robert, worried about the cost of my protection. "There is no relationship," Robert said without hesitation. "He stopped being my son the moment he laid a hand on you. You are my daughter now, and protecting you is my only priority." The relief I felt at those words was indescribable. For the first time in years, I felt truly safe, truly protected by the people who were supposed to love me. The secret that had poisoned my life for so long was finally out in the open, and instead of destroying our family as Jake had always threatened, it had only made my parents more determined to keep me safe. That night, I slept peacefully for the first time in years, knowing that Jake would never again be able to slip into my room in the darkness, never again be able to hurt me or threaten me into silence. The nightmare that had defined my childhood was finally over, and though the healing would take time, I could finally begin to imagine a future free from fear. The months that followed my revelation were a whirlwind of legal proceedings, therapy sessions, and gradual healing that transformed not just my life, but our entire family dynamic. Jake was arrested 3 days later when he attempted to return for his scheduled weekend visit, unaware that his world had already crumbled in his absence. The look of shock and rage on his face when the police officers placed him in handcuffs was something I'll never forget. Not because it gave me satisfaction, but because it marked the moment when his power over me officially ended. The trial process was exhausting and traumatic in its own way. I had to testify multiple times, facing Jake across a courtroom while recounting the details of years of abuse. His lawyer tried every tactic to discredit my testimony, suggesting I was a troubled teenager seeking attention or trying to break up my mother's marriage. But the physical evidence, my consistent accounts, and the testimony of Mrs. Henderson and other witnesses who had observed changes in my behavior painted a clear picture that even the most skeptical jury couldn't ignore. My mother never left my side during those court appearances. She would sit in the front row where I could see her, offering encouraging smiles and silent strength when the questioning became particularly brutal. Robert attended every session, as well, his presence a constant reminder that I had protectors now, people who believed me and would fight for me no matter what. The day the guilty verdict was read, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. Relief, certainly, but also sadness for the childhood I had lost and the innocence that could never be recovered. Jake was sentenced to 8 years in prison, with mandatory registration as a sex offender upon release. It felt like justice, though no sentence could truly undo the damage he had caused. Dr. Williams, the therapist my parents found for me, became an unexpected lifeline during those difficult months. She was a soft-spoken woman in her 50s who specialized in trauma recovery, and she had a gift for creating safe spaces where I could explore my feelings without judgment. In her office, surrounded by plants and comfortable furniture that felt nothing like a medical setting, I began the slow work of rebuilding my sense of self. The first breakthrough came about 6 months into our sessions, when Dr. Williams helped me understand that the shame I carried wasn't mine to bear. For years, I had internalized Jake's manipulation, believing on some level that I was complicit in my own abuse. Learning to separate his actions from my worth as a person was like learning to walk all over again. But with each session, I felt stronger and more certain of my own innocence. School became a refuge in ways it had never been before. With the secret finally out and Jake permanently out of my life, I found myself able to concentrate on my studies with renewed focus. My grades improved dramatically, and I discovered a passion for literature that I had never fully explored while living under the shadow of abuse. Mrs. Henderson became more than just a teacher. She became a mentor who encouraged my writing and helped me see that my experiences, however painful, had given me insights that could help others. Sophie, my loyal friend who had watched me struggle for years without understanding why, was one of the first people outside my family to learn the truth. Her reaction was everything I could have hoped for: immediate support, fierce protectiveness, and absolutely no judgment. She cried with me when I told her, angry that she hadn't been able to help me sooner, but also relieved to finally understand what had been wrong. "I knew something was hurting you," she said as we sat in her backyard, under the desert stars. "I just didn't know what. I'm so proud of you for finally telling someone." That took incredible courage. Her friendship became a bridge back to normal teenage experiences I had thought were lost forever. We had sleepovers again, spent hours talking about books and movies and boys at school, and slowly I began to remember what it felt like to simply be a 15-year-old girl with a future ahead of her. The relationship between my mother and Robert actually grew stronger through this crisis, which surprised everyone, including them. Rather than driving them apart as Jake had always threatened it would, my revelation brought them closer together in their shared commitment to my healing and protection. Robert's immediate rejection of his son in favor of my safety proved to my mother that she had chosen the right man, while her fierce advocacy for me showed Robert the depths of her maternal love. They started attending counseling together to process their own guilt and learn how to best support my recovery. Robert struggled particularly with feelings of responsibility, wondering how he had raised a son capable of such cruelty. But Dr. Williams helped him understand that Jake's choices were his own, influenced by factors beyond Robert's control, and that his response to learning the truth was what truly mattered. My junior year of high school marked a turning point in my healing journey. I had developed enough confidence to join the drama club, something that would have been impossible during my years of hiding. Acting allowed me to explore different aspects of my personality, to practice being bold and confident and unafraid. The first time I delivered a monologue on stage and felt the audience's attention as support rather than judgment, I knew I had reclaimed something important about myself. College applications became a source of excitement rather than anxiety. I applied to universities across the country, no longer limited by the need to stay close to home for protection. My essay about overcoming adversity was powerful enough, to earn me acceptance to several prestigious schools, along with scholarship offers that would make my dreams financially possible. Daniel entered my life during my senior year, a quiet boy from my advanced placement literature class, who shared my love of poetry and had a gentle manner that never made me feel threatened or uncomfortable. Our friendship developed slowly and, naturally, built on shared interests and mutual respect rather than the complex power dynamics I had learned to fear. When I finally told him about my past, we had been dating for several months and I had grown to trust him completely. His reaction was everything I could have hoped for: compassion without pity, anger at Jake without transferring that anger to me, and a deeper understanding of my occasional moments of anxiety or hesitation. "Thank you for trusting me with this," he said simply. "It doesn't change how I feel about you except to make me admire your strength even more." College at Arizona State University opened up a world of possibilities I had never imagined. Studying literature and psychology, I began to understand trauma and recovery from both personal and academic perspectives. I volunteered at a local crisis center, using my own experiences to help other survivors find their voices and begin their own healing journeys. It was during my sophomore year that I met Dr. Patricia, a psychology professor who would become both a mentor and a surrogate mother figure. She recognized something in my writing and advocacy work that she said was rare: the ability to transform personal pain into universal understanding. Under her guidance, I began to consider graduate school and a career in trauma counseling. My relationship with Daniel deepened through college, built on a foundation of honesty and mutual support that I had never believed possible. He accompanied me to therapy sessions when I needed extra support, celebrated my victories in recovery, and never made me feel broken or damaged because of my past. When he proposed during our senior year, it felt like the ultimate proof that Jake had been wrong about everything. I was worthy of love, capable of trust, and deserving of happiness. Our wedding was small but perfect, held in the backyard of the house my parents had bought after moving away from the scene of so much trauma. My mother cried happy tears as she helped me into the dress she had sewn herself, a creation of ivory silk and delicate lace that made me feel like the princess I had never been allowed to be as a child. Robert walked me down the aisle with pride, evident in every step, having officially adopted me the year before, so that we would be legally as well as emotionally father and daughter. Dr. Williams attended as an honored guest, along with Mrs. Henderson, Sophie, and all the other people who had supported my journey from victim to survivor to someone who could help others heal. Motherhood came to me at 26, 3 years after Daniel and I settled in Denver, where he had found work as a social worker, and I had established a private practice specializing in childhood trauma. Holding my daughter Emma for the first time, I was overwhelmed by the fierce protectiveness that I recognized from my mother's face all those years ago when the truth finally came out. As Emma grew, followed 2 years later by her brother Michael, I found myself hypervigilant about their safety in ways that sometimes worried Daniel. But Dr. Williams, who I still consulted occasionally, helped me find the balance between protection and paranoia, between keeping them safe and allowing them to live freely. My children grew up knowing an age-appropriate version of my story, understanding why Mommy sometimes worked with sad people who had been hurt, and why we talked so much about body safety and speaking up when something felt wrong. They learned that families could overcome terrible things, that telling the truth was always the right choice, and that healing was possible even from the deepest wounds. When Emma turned 15, the same age I had been when everything changed, I felt the full circle of my journey in ways that were both painful and profound. Watching her navigate the normal challenges of teenage life with confidence and openness, surrounded by people who loved and protected her, I finally understood how different my life could have been if Jake had never entered it. But I also understood that without that experience, I might never have developed the empathy and strength that allowed me to help hundreds of other survivors find their own paths to healing. My practice had grown to include not just individual, Therapy, but also training programs for teachers, social workers, and law enforcement officers on recognizing signs of abuse and creating safe spaces for disclosure. The work was difficult, but deeply rewarding. Every time I helped a child find their voice, every family I helped navigate the aftermath of disclosure, every survivor I watched reclaim their power and rebuild their life, I felt the meaning in my own suffering. Jake had intended to destroy me, but instead, his abuse had created someone uniquely qualified to heal others who had walked similar paths. My mother lived to see her grandchildren graduate from college, proud of the family we had built from, the ashes of trauma. She passed peacefully at 78, surrounded by love and secure in the knowledge that her fierce protection of me had set in motion a legacy of healing that would continue for generations. Now, at 72, I look back on my life with a perspective that would have seemed impossible to my 15-year-old self. The pain was real, the trauma was devastating, but it did not define the entirety of my existence. I became a wife, a mother, a healer, a voice for those who struggle to find their own. I learned that resilience is not about avoiding damage, but about how we rebuild ourselves afterward. To anyone listening who recognizes their own story in mine, I want you to know that speaking up was the hardest thing I ever did. But it was also the most important. The people who love you want to protect you, even if the truth is difficult to hear. You are not responsible for keeping family secrets that hurt you, and you deserve to live without fear. The road to healing is long and sometimes lonely, but it leads to places of beauty and peace that are worth every difficult step. Trust your voice, trust your worth, and know that even in the darkest moments, you are not alone. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.